With the release of Pokemon Legends Arceus, developer Game Freak offers up its most ambitious break from the Pokemon formula, a formula that's been tweaked, adjusted countless times since the 1996 classics on Game Boy. There have been forward steps with every game since, of course, a slow edge away from the 2D sprite work, top-down camera view, and random battles that defined the series early on. The 3DS era, for example, had games like Pokemon X and Y push for a far more flexible 3D camera in towns, even if it was usually out of a player's control outside of these areas. And more recently on Nintendo Switch, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee replaced random battles entirely with a more transparent approach, showing Pokemon on the field itself. The steps have been gradual, and Arceus in 2022 at last promises a complete reinvention. A game with reworked mechanics for battling, catching Pokemon, as well as an engine overhaul to let you freely explore a 3D world. There's a lot to love here, but equally there have been criticisms of its visuals, the technical design of Arceus compared to other open world games on Switch. First, the good stuff. In Pokemon Legends Arceus, we have what I genuinely consider to be a top-to-bottom rewrite, a game that delivers on a promise to truly let you explore its world in full freedom, to discover, catch, and battle Pokemon in a kind of Breath of the Wild-esque seamless environment. One filled with secrets, a day-night cycle, dynamic weather, all making full use of a 3D camera to spot every detail. Actually, it even lets you go to a first-person view with a left trigger pull. The result? Honestly, the most exciting mainline Pokemon game to come out in years, and mechanically it sets out a whole new template. Pokemon roaming its world are now caught by sneaking through grass, aiming a Pokeball, and launching it at a target with the right trigger. Want to battle? Well, that happens now, seamlessly, on the spot, with you issuing commands as you circle around the duel. There's no cutaway to a separate battle sequence, plus the sheer proportion, the size of select Pokemon is factored into the game world, with more fearsome, legendary creatures looming large. Especially coming from 2019's Pokemon Sword and Shield, it's a staggering upgrade. In the context of Pokemon games, Arceus is unlike anything we've seen from Game Freak. And yet, the game has drawn some criticism from fans, a lot of it justifiable, I think. The brunt of the criticism is really focused on Arceus' visuals and polish. For all the millions in revenue Pokemon makes every year as a franchise, one of the biggest in entertainment, and for all the years fans have waited for a true evolutionary leap, it's hard to accept Arceus meets all the hype and expectation. Let's start with the open world design. There's no skirting around the obvious. Pop-in is an issue for the game right from the start. Just running into the first open region or the early village, grass just fizzles into view right in eyesight. Bigger environments spread out for virtual acres and are even worse still. The scene appears flat, barren, and lifeless from any high vantage. Shadows only render close to the player, and trees visibly fade in at the medium range. Perhaps worst of all, the level of detail on geometry, like terrain, changes with a sharp pop right ahead of you. For most, the gameplay of Arceus is golden, addictive and enticing enough to ignore all these visual problems. Playing Switch as a handheld will also admittedly help to a certain extent. Still, the pop-in issues become harder to ignore the further you play. Past the first 4 to 5 hours, let's say, Arceus encourages you to move faster once you encounter rideable mounts, speeding up travel by land, air, and even water. Riding a Weirdeer, for example, geometry pop-in ratchets up to a whole other level. Entire chunks of scenery flicker into the world, trees, shadows, cliffs, grass. The problem isn't just that it is pop-in, but it's that there's no seamless transition for any of these elements as we run. It's all presented as an abrupt flicker or snap as new assets are pulled in. Sometimes you'll be stood on an LOD threshold, an awkward midpoint where the engine can't choose whether to draw a shadow or a tree or not, and so it flickers in and out instead. All combined, it just creates this impression of a lack of polish to one of the most important parts of Arceus' package, its world. Partly this is to be expected. Moving the Pokemon series to an open environment for the first time, with a free camera to boot, is a big move. It creates new challenges for any developer to optimize around Switch's mobile Tegra X1 chipset. Still, it's no excuse given the competition, especially looking back over Switch's other big open-world games. Let's run through just a few. The most obvious would be Zelda Breath of the Wild, a swan song for Wii U, a Switch launch game, and one that forms, at least in part, an inspiration for Arceus. The cel-shaded style, the freeform exploration, animated trees, dynamic time of day, shadows, it's all there in Zelda running at 30 frames per second on Switch, just as with Arceus. These parts look superb in both games. Still, 5 years into Switch's lifespan, the latest Pokemon does admittedly have a harder time disguising its draw distance limits. It struggles to hide those pop-in transitions, even for slow on-foot travel similar to Breath of the Wild. Now, Nintendo Switch is capable of some incredible looking games, especially recently. A good example would be Xenoblade Chronicles 2, released in 2017, 2 years after Breath of the Wild, and another open world game with a 30 FPS target. Rich, broad spaces overflowing with plant life are a big focus for developer Monolith Soft. The horizon is often beautifully detailed, with high rises, overhanging oaks covered in moss, with little LOD pop-in close to the player. Effects like mist also add depth to the scene, with post-process techniques like bloom and TAA also in place. At a basic tech level, Switch is handily pushing detailed geometry, grass that's fully shaded, all with more seamless transitions as you run across the world. The only downside for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, well, it's that frame rates aren't exactly locked to 30 FPS in all cases, and it's a game that truly pushes what's possible on Switch. Though that being said, the Switch remake of the first Xenoblade Chronicles does a much better job at locking at 30 FPS. A game that also shows Nintendo's console handling beautiful open-world environments. So that's what the competition is able to do on Switch. Knowing what other games are doing on the hardware doesn't negate the quality of Arceus though. It's still wonderful, addictive, and fun to explore. It's not just the pop-in though that stands out as a bit of a shortfall for the game. The pop-in is bad, but there's plenty else that makes you wonder if this really is the best Arceus could have been. Texture quality, for example, is broadly set to a low resolution, materials blurring visibly across the landscape, which sadly stands at odds with its beautiful, crisp skybox. Water also uses a screen space technique for reflections, an expected approach on Switch that usually works well. The problem is the shaders layered over any water body flicker constantly as you walk past, especially just at the shoreline. Again, it adds to this sense of instability to the image. Also, I did notice lit cave entrances produce visual artifacts around a character. These are often bright flickering pixels, and at first you might mistake this for a kind of bug. The point? Well, none of these issues help make Arceus feel like a premium Pokemon experience. For all the brilliance of the refreshed open-world gameplay, it doesn't always look like a polished end product. Cut to a more recent Switch game like 2021's Monster Hunter Rise, and it's clear what Switch is capable of in materials, lighting, even water. All again at a stable 30 FPS in this case. In terms of Arceus' presentation, the world is at least crisp. There's a surprise here, in that it's running at a dynamic 1080p while docked under a TV, with resolution dropping to 900p lowest in more taxing spots. To its credit, a 900 to 1080p range is a plus, next to the 720p in Monster Hunter Rise or Xenoblade Chronicles 2. The only downside, Arceus runs with no anti-aliasing to speak of, zero AA. Just like previous Pokemon games on Switch, it presents the image raw, creating visible shimmer and sawtooth edges across the image. As for portable play in handheld mode, the resolution changes to a fixed 720p instead, which holds up better, always keeping a 1:1 pixel match for Switch's screen. In comparison between portable and docked play, well, the good news is resolution is really the only difference. All other visual settings stay in place, draw distances, textures, everything. You don't lose much playing on the go, barring a slight drop off in texture filtering quality. In review then, we have pop-in, low quality textures, and a lack of anti-aliasing. The final issue with Arceus right now though relates to its performance while docked. With the 30fps cap, it holds reasonably well in most areas, but too often you'll hit upon a distracting frame rate hitch. Playing Switch docked under a TV, there's a few causes for sub-30 performance. Firstly, when trees or any transparent element blocks the camera, you'll hit a sudden brief lurch into the high 20s. It's likely a GPU bottleneck, as a transparency blends with its 1080p output for a split second. Again though, it is just a hitch. And likewise, moving to and from the first-person camera view, the engine at times struggles to keep up for a moment. Sadly, for such an open-world design, removing the traditional fixed camera view does seem to have this side effect. Developer Game Freak can't optimize the frame rate around a fixed perspective anymore, and as it stands, the engine does struggle to adjust to a flexible 3D camera controlled by the player. The second cause of frame rate drops is more obvious. In busy GPU taxing spots like the first village, the dynamic resolution needs to switch between 900p and 1080p. However, it appears to need a few frames to trigger the change. Similar to the likes of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, lowering and raising the camera causes a frame rate hitch as a result, while the renderer adjusts to on-screen load. You'll see it all the time while exploring Arceus' world. Dropping the viewpoint from, say, a simple skybox to a busy landscape cues a kind of half second where the frame rate drops, and DRS adjusts to 900p. Equally, sharp movements on the camera lead to similar drops without much warning. None of these are aggressive, never is it all that prolonged, but it does stick out as another distraction to add to the list. With all these frame rate drops in mind, there is actually one way to play Arceus at a locked 30fps, playing handheld. Surprisingly, by sticking to a native 720p resolution while in handheld mode, Arceus is better optimized for the Tegra X1's GPU clock speeds in a portable state. And conversely, it does kind of prove a dynamic 1080p in docked mode, even with drops to 900p in taxing areas, is really a stretch too far for the machine. So played purely as a handheld experience, yes, there are no similar FPS drops while changing the camera view. No drops either while passing through transparency-heavy areas, or even while travelling quickly across the world. For those who want the smoothest experience, portable play feels like the mode Game Freak prioritised in performance, and it shows. In review then, Pokemon Legends Arceus is both wonderful and frustrating. On the one hand, it's an addictive, revised take on the Pokemon series. The core gameplay loop works, of exploring and battling all in one 3D environment, and it's a great template for the series going forward. But on the other, it pales in comparison to other open world games on Switch, even dating back a year ago with Monster Hunter Rise. I don't expect full realism from Pokemon, I never will. A level of stylization works, but as Xenoblade Chronicles 2 shows, a cel-shaded aesthetic does pair well with a strong technical backbone. Sadly, the glaring pop-in, artifacting on reflections, the sub-30 hitches, and even lack of features like anti-aliasing are big distractions in Arceus. A lot of this is minimized, or at least made less obvious by running in portable mode. Even so, it's not enough to escape the feeling it's a missed opportunity. I'll be playing Arceus regardless. Game Freak's world, characters, and the sense of adventure it inspires in longtime fans make it a huge breath of fresh air. It's the mark of a new era, As the first of a new breed of Pokemon games on Switch, we'll hopefully see its presentation evolve in follow-up games, refining its technical design. Or better still, patch updates could solve many of the issues we're seeing at launch, because clearly there's huge room for expansion in Arceus' features outside of its visual presentation. The ability to trade Pokemon with local players is included, but actually battling friends over Wi-Fi somehow hasn't made the grade for release. There's a sense Arceus' initial launch is just a first step for the developer, and given the success of the game in pure sales terms, hopefully work is ongoing to improve it in all aspects. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this tech breakdown of Pokemon Legends Arceus, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.